Welcome everyone to today's episode of our Chevy Chase at Home speaker series. As you may know, Chevy Chase at Home brings neighbors together to offer the practical support and vital social connections to age confidently at home and to stay active and stimulated. Chevy Chase at Home engages our community in social and educational programs both in person and virtually, and provides volunteer services to older adults who need assistance, including rides, errands, tech support, household assistance, and friendly visits. One of the ways we engage with the world is by bringing interesting speakers to share their insights and experiences with us. Today's speaker is Aaron David Miller, who will talk with us about America in the Middle East. He's a veteran State Department Middle East analyst, advisor, and negotiator in both Republican and Democratic administrations. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy, and the author of 5 books. Welcome, Aaron.
Susan, thanks so much. And thanks for Chevy Chase at Home for having me. Lindsay and I and my kids have been living in Chevy Chase in one form or another since 1977. And it's just an extraordinary community. A shout out, I see Rich Cooper and Judy Areen out there. We love you guys. I just want to let you know. I'm going to try in 30 minutes to do what is virtually impossible, which is to provide a number of comments on the current realities in the Middle East. And I'll speak for 30 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions. I want to make 3 points, though, which are important to me, because you should have some sense of the way I look at the world. First and most importantly, I worked for Republicans and Democrats, and I voted for Republicans and Democrats. It is my conviction that the dividing line for an effective U.S. foreign policy should not be between left and right, liberal, conservative, or Republican or Democrat. It should be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters to me in the service of the national interest is which side of the line you want America to be on, the smart side or the not so smart side. And there are things that can be done as citizens to help ensure that we can remain on the smart side. But I do believe, again, in the national interest, which transcends party affiliation, partisan politics, and egos. Second, I do not believe, and my career in diplomacy has persuaded me, I do not believe usually in transformations in politics or diplomacies. They're rare. We were told COVID would fundamentally change life as we knew it. It didn't. Then we were told that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would make international politics unrecognizable. Transformations are very hard. And mostly when it comes to diplomacy, life in conflict resolution is about transactions, smart deals, which over time, if they are smart or wise, can evolve and lead perhaps to more enduring and transformative change. And I am a follower. I'm not a religious person, but I am a follower of the late Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued that the best you can do in politics and diplomacy is to come up with proximate solutions to insoluble problems. If we could get proximate solutions to what ails the Republic at home, let alone the challenges that confront America abroad, if we could get proximate solutions to these extraordinarily tough and difficult challenges, we'd be doing pretty well. And finally, geography, in my judgment, is destiny. If you want to understand why America behaves the way it does, then I think the place to begin is to look at its location, location, location. We are the only great power in history, I would argue, that has non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and literally fish to our east and west, what one historian cleverly, wisely described as our liquid assets. I would argue due to these two oceans and the fact that we have non-predatory neighbors who do not threaten the existence of the Republic has given us the time and space to become the best of who we are. And the nations that we deal with around the world do not have the fortuitous um, security, unprecedented, unparalleled security that we have. Whether they're big nations, China, smaller nations, Iran, Israel, Russia, geography and history have been constraints to these countries. Our geography and history, in my judgment, gives us a much better chance. And I think one of the reasons this republic has accomplished as much as it has, and it has a long way to go, and it is at risk in so many respects these days, is because of that geographical advantage. It explains our idealism, it explains our pragmatism, and it also explains our arrogance because we have a margin for error that no other country in the world has. We can make mistakes abroad, and we have, without necessarily threatening the political integrity or physical security of the nation. So let me make a couple of points here. Number one, the war. Let me be very clear about something. To me, this was a war of choice. Um, and it has evolved, in my judgment, into a war of necessity. When I say a war of choice, I do not mean to suggest that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a major challenge or a threat to the United States. There's no question that it is. It's a brutal, authoritarian, repressive regime that imprisons, tortures, and persecutes its citizens. It spreads its ideology, death to Israel, death to the United States, to at least 4 or 5 Arab capitals. So I'm not here to argue and brief that Iran is not a problem. The question is, what were the objectives in dealing with this problem, and what are the costs? And I think by any standard, we are now, April 28th will be the beginning of the second month of this war. Uppsala University and University of Chicago studied every interstate conflict since 1815, every one interstate, right, between nations. They came to the conclusion that the average length of an interstate war since 1815 was 3 to 4 months. We're now 2 months into this war, and I see no quick or easy way um, out of it. And I think in large part that reflects the decision to go to war without thinking through the relationship between means and ends and the objectives that the administration, and particularly this president, because much of the decision making on these matters, and it should, I worked for administrations from Jimmy Carter to Bush 43. Constitution gives the president as commander in chief extraordinary discretion to make foreign policy. But he or she, one day she makes foreign policy in the context of a system which should have a functional and structured decision-making process. And I'm afraid on this one, that decision-making process was woefully inadequate. So a decision was made to go to war, to command the extraordinary power of the U.S. military. And for 6 weeks, we saw the damage and the degradation that the U.S. military, as well as the Israelis, who were partners in this war of choice, in an extraordinary manner. More on that when I talk a bit about Israel. The question is, what was the relationship between the application of this military power and the objectives of the war? If you notice the administration's objectives now, a lot of what the administration wanted to do has now been shelved. There's no talk anymore about regime change. There's no talk anymore about breaking Iran's support for its proxies, Hamas or Hezbollah. There's no talk even about restricting Iran's ballistic missile capacity and its drones. So the issue for the administration, because I think in a war of choice, the metrics for success are much higher than in a war of necessity, it's come down to two issues. One, the nuclear issue, which presumably was the sort of point of departure for, and has been for Republican and Democratic administrations dealing with Iran, what to do about Iran's putative nuclear weapons aspirations, how to constrain it, how to contain it. That's one issue. And the second issue is the Straits of Hormuz. Now, it has become a war of necessity, in my judgment, because initially it was a war launched by Israel and the United States against Iran. But the minute the Iranians, and I come back to geography as destiny here, the minute the Iranians decided to deploy geography as a weapon, it changed. It changed because this was no longer an issue just confined to US, Israeli, or Iranian interest. This now affected one of the critical choke points on the planet, the global economy and oil. And it has begun to have second and third effects 6 or 7 weeks in that are going to be very, very, very hard to undo. Natural gas, 25% of it comes through from Qatar through the Straits of Hormuz. The Ras Laffan facility that the Qataris have constructed has uh, had tremendous hits and maybe several years before it's repaired. Iraqi oil wells, since they can't export the oil through the straits, and they have a maximum storage capacity, they had to shut in or shut down their wells. And this is a problem that's going to continue to occur. The Saudis have an option. They have an east-west pipeline, east-west across Saudi Arabia into the Red Sea. But should the Houthis in Yemen decide to enter this conflict, which they haven't in this phase, you could see a second checkpoint and 5 million additional barrels of oil would be taken off the market. So the administration did not calculate the possibility that the Iranian regime would not only survive and not fracture, but would remain in control with the capacity to do two things: to control the straits, 20% of global oil production on a daily basis, roughly what, 15 to 20 million barrels through the Straits of Hormuz. And second, and I think it was Mark Twain who said that proximity breeds contempt and children. It was Mark Twain. Proximity breeds contempt and children. Proximity also breeds vulnerability. And the Gulf states, in my judgment, 2 months into this war, are the big losers. Their security, their stability are now threatened in a major way. They're now more dependent on the United States than ever and probably angrier at the US and Israel for launching this war. And of course, they've used terms like finish the job, the Saudis, but I'm not sure what finish the job really means anymore. The regime has survived. Much of its leadership, including the supreme leader, has been decapitated. But the Iranians are prepared for this. They've layered their decision-making process. And you now have a shift in transition from what one observer called divine power, that is to say, the influence of the clerical establishment in Iran, the supreme leader and his son, who is, and I would urge you all to read the New York Times story by Farnaz Farhasi this morning on the new generation of leaders in Iran. It's brilliant. Without access to classified information, it would rival anything CIA would send to the president. You made a transition from divine power to what the observer described as hard power. You now have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that developed in 1979 to protect the revolution by Ali Khamenei, the late supreme leader. These guys control the money, the oil, and the guns. And the reality is they're here to stay. There is not a shred of empirical evidence right now to indicate in any way, shape, or form that the regime is fracturing or that there is an opposition in the streets, capable, willing, able. Iranians, the 90 million people who live in this country, are now courageous and brave, as so many of the demonstrators have been, are trying to get by. And should the war escalate, and should the president's threats to go after civilian infrastructure, desalinization plants, power grids, make the country dark and thirsty. I think the Iranians will retaliate again against the Gulf states in ways that will permanently destroy much of what the Emirates and the Saudis have built with respect to their oil processing facilities. I'm not predicting that, but before we leave the war, uh, I want to make one final point. I do not see, there are two options here, it seems to me. Number one is you diffuse the issue in the Straits. We now have a blockade, a very effective blockade. The U.S. Navy, half a dozen destroyers sit outside the Straits of Hormuz, maybe 400 miles outside, far away from Iranian direct hits by short-range Iranian ballistic missiles. They've stopped 27 tankers as far out as the Indian Ocean. 90% of Iran's imports come through seaborne trade. The Iranians are now cut off from income from selling oil, roughly almost 2 million barrels a day. 2 million, I'm sorry, 2 million barrels a day. If the blockade were kept for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, I think that the regime would face major problems. The problem is that the Iranians, at some point, relatively soon, if the blockade isn't lifted and they won't open the straits, may well retaliate against the Gulf states. So right now, I see no pathway to a negotiated solution. And I do not see this pressure. I'm not an Iran expert. I don't play one on television, but every Iranian expert I've talked to, Iranian Americans, people who have studied Iran for their entire careers, basically say that no amount of military pressure will force the regime to capitulate or fundamentally give up their core objectives at the negotiating table. So, on one hand, you have escalation, and on the other, you have a very challenging and problematic uh, prospects of a negotiation. And I, for one, am unwilling and or unable to make any sort of prediction, basically on how, um, whether there's a pathway out of this war. Um, Let me make a few points on the U.S.-Israeli relationship because the Israelis are clearly part of this, to say the least. Um, there is a urban legend building, I think, that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, whose life mission it was, without a doubt, basically either conned or pressured, forced Donald Trump into this war. There is no doubt, and the New York Times reporting is I think quite accurate on this, that the Israelis laid out a very compelling case, led by the director of Mossad, David Barnea, who is not prone to transformative happy endings in the Middle East, but a case was made that a comprehensive Israeli military U.S. strike could decapitate the leadership and could lay the conditions for a regime change. 2 months in, that is not likely. I think that Netanyahu made a very compelling case. I think, however, that he was pushing on a very, 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 I can't say the word very enough, open door with respect to the president. And I think the president's calculations were shaped by what I would call recency bias, his own recent experiences. Number one was Venezuela, where in fact a brilliant tactical operation by the U.S. Special Operations Forces grabbed Maduro and his wife um, in an operation that's going to be studied by special ops for years. And Donald Trump found Delcy Rodriguez, a vice president, partly ideologue, but a pragmatist, who frankly was willing and able, since the regime was composed of a number of elements, none of which had a common ideology or a power structure to basically cut a deal. Um, that I think encouraged him to believe that a similar comprehend this time using the brunt force of the U.S. military, that he would find in Tehran an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez. What he found instead um, was an Iranian Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So it was that recency bias that I think led him to be amenable to the persuasions that regime change was possible. Second was his own experience with Iran. He was warned in 2018 not to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement. He was told it would be a catastrophe. You might even get a regional war. He did withdraw, and it's probably likely we wouldn't be having this conversation had he not withdrawn. It's a counterfactual, we don't know. But I think there's high probability that this war would not have taken place if that agreement had been in place. But all the bad things that people said would happen immediately to Donald Trump or the administration if he withdrew didn't happen. Then he was told in 2020 not to kill the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Al-Quds Committee, Qasem Soleimani, a brilliant mastermind who took charge of Iran's external operations in places like Gaza and Lebanon and Iraq. He killed Soleimani. The Iranians responded against an Iraqi airbase and inflicted significant casualties on Americans, some with traumatic brain injuries. But the regional war people predicted never occurred. And then last June, he was told and offered the possibility of attacking 3 Iranian nuclear sites. He was told, you could get regional war out of this. And nothing happened. The Iranians retaliated with a strike in Qatar, which was widely telegraphed, with no damage. So Donald Trump's mindset was that if we do this, the Iranians will either capitulate, they'll see the light, I'll find an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, and Donald Trump. And remember, the Israelis, whether it was CIA intelligence or Israeli intelligence, I suspect it was the latter, told him that on February 28th, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who had ruled Iran since the death of Khomeini in 1989 and who was responsible for much of Iranian policy, would be at a place certain at a time certain. And I don't think Trump could resist the fact of starting the war on February 28th and killing the supreme leader as well as many other top national security officials and clerics. I think this is what motivated him to push to this war. So yes, Netanyahu played a big role in terms of making the presentation. The president grabbed the opportunity. The same Netanyahu who played such an important role in the beginning, however, is not going to play much of a role in how the war ends. And if in fact it does, and you see this in the recent decision by the president to force the Israelis, without any doubt, to conclude a ceasefire in Lebanon, which began April 17th. It's still holding. It expires Monday. And I suspect if Trump wants it renewed, it will be renewed. And Netanyahu will be compliant for one reason. It is not Gaza, it is not Lebanon, it is not Iran that is top of mind. It is elections. The government, Israeli government, the most right-wing, just reporting here, the most right-wing government in the history of the state of Israel will go to term in October of this year. Elections may happen before that. But this Israeli prime minister on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court before 3 judges, now 5 years in running, will face elections. He needs to remain in power or block others from forming a government. Because if he doesn't, he will face one of two possibilities. One, he will either be convicted or acquitted by three judges. If it looks like conviction, then he will probably argue for a plea deal, which he will get, but it will mean his exit from politics permanently. So he faces an unpalatable choice. He needs Donald Trump to be elected. Donald Trump cannot elect him, but Donald Trump is more popular in Israel than he is. And Benjamin Netanyahu, on many accounts, is still very vulnerable. If you look at his numbers, they have not risen much as a consequence of 2 months of this war. It's still very much an open story about who will form the next government. Netanyahu with the same government, Netanyahu with a different government, no Netanyahu. But be that as it may, the president of the United States has tremendous leverage, and Netanyahu will not be determinative in terms of how this war ends. Let me conclude just with a couple other comments. Um, I guess it's the broader issue of the Middle East and America's role in it. Um, Sometimes I think that we are like, and again, I've worked and voted for Republicans and Democrats. This is not just a problem of this administration. Let's keep in mind, I left government in 2003, having worked for Colin Powell for 2 years, 2 months before the second Bush administration, filled with extraordinarily talented people, including the Secretary of State I worked for, Condi Rice, Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, um, launched a war of choice, which ultimately morphed into the two longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when would we leave? And what would we leave behind? And extrication is not the kind of metric you want to use to, at least this extrication, because you look at Afghanistan, and while Iraq is better off without Saddam, no doubt about that, the cost that was paid for this war, the loss of American lives, the scores of thousands of Iraqis who were killed, civilians. This was a war of choice. So this is not just a Trumpian problem abroad. Um, I sometimes look at Americans in the Middle East as a sort of modern day Gulliver, wandering around in a part of the world that we really don't understand that well, tied up by tiny and larger powers whose interests sometimes coincide with ours, but many times do not. And that, by the way, applies both to our Israeli partners and our Arab partners, and burdened and tied up by our own illusions. And this is very concerning to me because the Middle East, more often than not, has been a place where U.S. ideas on war making and peacemaking go to die. And because that is the history of this region, which is literally littered with the remains of great powers who wrongly believe they can impose their will on smaller ones. We need to be extremely careful, risk averse. We can still lead, and we have. Certainly on the diplomatic side. I worked for Bush 41, and my boss then was James Baker. Pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait was a measured and limited use of American military power to achieve a feasible end, not perfect. But it led to a moment where the US was admired, feared, and respected to the degree that I think America needs to be in the world today. Um, and in my judgment, again, having voted and worked for Democrats and Republicans, we have not been admired, feared, and respected since those 4 years. Um, we made major mistakes. The war in Iraq and this war of choice in Iran. And I think we just have to fundamentally understand that by the very nature of the roles that we play, as opposed to those who live in the neighborhood, our influence and power is going to be always limited by one essential fact. For the people in the neighborhood, this is an existential issue. They will always be willing to do things we would never consider, to survive pressures that we would apply, because for them it is existential. I mean, I spent most of my professional life in the efforts in the peacemaking business. Sadat paid for his life for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Rabin, who I knew well, paid for his life with an Oslo process that didn't end the way he might have wanted it to end. So we can't be, we won't, it will never be existential for us, largely because we have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish stories to our west, these liquid assets. But that's a cautionary tale. We need to remember this. And I'll close with one other point. I don't know who authored this piece of philosophy, but it is elemental to life, politics, and diplomacy. And it goes like this. In the history of the world, I'm exaggerating, nobody ever washed a rental car. Okay, so what is that? What's that all about? It's because most normal people don't wash their rental cars. People, maybe to a fault, care only about what they own. And there is insufficient ownership in this region. The largely men who have dominated it have been by and large more interested in keeping their own seats than in trying to secure the prosperity and the security of their respective peoples. And we are missing leaders of the stature that actually accomplished extraordinary things. There are no Sadats, there are no Begins, there are no King Husseins, there are no Rabins, even Arafat. We dealt with him for hundreds of hours, despite all of his transgressions and difficulties. Arafat played a critically important role. Had Rabin not been murdered in November of 95, and again, I'm reflecting a bias here, so you can shoot me if you want. Had Bush 41 and his eminently talented Secretary of State, James Baker, got another 4 years, I believe we would have had one agreement, either between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Syria. And that's a counterfactual. I can't prove it, but it demonstrates the fundamental point that unless you have leaders who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their immediate circumstances and their own ideologies, we're going nowhere. And we don't have that kind of leadership. We don't have it here. We don't have it in Israel. We do not have it among the Palestinian national movement, as fractured and dysfunctional as it is. And that's a real challenge. We can't create it. So I think I've done pretty good, 130 something. Happy to listen to comments and questions. I'd only add that I didn't come here to sell you anything. These are my observations. You can reject some of them, you can accept some of them, we can talk about the others. But they're important in my view, which is why I thought it would be good for me to share them with you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a few of the questions that have popped up here. One is, could we simply terminate the blockade and end the war?
Great question. If we terminated the blockade and the Iranians opened the straits, truly opened them, not the way they said they opened them, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps imposing three conditions, which basically meant that they were in some respect, closed. Yeah, if we remove the blockade and they open the straits, then you could create the time and space necessary to see, and I don't know if there's an answer here, to see whether or not you could actually reach an agreement that would, to use your phrase, end the war. But the Gulf now is a potential hotspot, and it could escalate very easily. We could get back to the first 6 weeks of that war, which I don't think the Iranians want, and I'm pretty sure since his clock is ticking faster than Iran's, I don't think that's what Trump wants. He wants out.
Yeah. Okay, now here's thank you. A long message from Liz. Bill Clinton supposedly had a chance to get UBL, but decided not to because of possible civilian UAE civilian loss. This is before 9/11. Do you think this was part Trump's calculus, that he didn't want to make this type of move, which might be viewed by some as a mistake? And second part of this is on Bill Maher's show, Rahm Emanuel said that the current policy was more in Israel's best interest than the U.S. His point was that our policies should be in U.S. interests. And what
Yeah.
is your view on that?
Not sure about the first question, but I'll deal with the second. Rahm has been very outspoken lately on this issue. In fact, I think he's called for ending taxpayer support
For the
for military assistance to Israel. He may have actually said that on Bill Maher. I knew Rahm when I worked for in the Clinton administration, and he was Rahm is very much attuned, and I think has very strong feelings on the positive side about the idea of Israel, the people of Israel, and the security of Israel, not the current government of Israel. And I I think that Ram's notion that, and I tell you my own view on this. We provide the Israelis with $3 billion a year, in which they basically use to buy U.S. military equipment. Israel is a very wealthy country. I think it would be much healthier for the U.S.-Israeli relationship
Osama bin Laden.
if we could sort of wean both of ourselves off of this piece of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It doesn't mean you're going to abandon Israeli security. You can still share intelligence. You can do research and development. You can joint exercise with the Israelis. There are ways, and the Prime Minister of Israel himself, a month or so ago, said that this is the direction in which we should go. I think it would produce a much healthier relationship. I'll offer another editorial comment while we're on the same subject. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump have done more, in my judgment, to undermine a resilient, healthy U.S.-Israel relationship and to
Mm,
kill the one adhesive, kill was too strong a word, to put extraordinary stress on the one element that is critically important for a healthy U.S.-Israel relationship, and that is bipartisanship. You now have a situation where the Republican Party, even though significant elements, certainly those outside of Congress, like Tucker Carlson, for example, and others, have become incredibly angry at the Israelis. And the Democratic Party is divided into those on the progressive side who want to sanction Israel, and even mainstream Democrats like Chris Van Hollen, my senator. I interviewed him on the show I have at Carnegie. I'll send you the link. It's worth watching. Chris Coons and Chris Murphy, who have at one point in the last several years, in the wake of October 7th, talked about conditioning, not ending, conditioning U.S. Military assistance to Israel. So the Democrats are now divided. increasing number of Republicans are critical. This is, I mean, we live in an argue culture in this country. Everything seems to be polarized. But what had been taken for granted has now become a sort of third rail in American politics. And I think Trump and Netanyahu have done enormous damage to polarizing this, to turning it into a situation where the President of the United States can actually say that he cannot understand how Jews, and I'm a member of the American Jewish community, how could Jews vote for Democrats? I mean, if you extend that statement and you draw the logical or illogical conclusion of where it goes, it gets you to a pretty dark side of this. And it all intersects, sadly, tragically, with the rise of white Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism. So I think it's been very harmful. I think it's going to take another American president and a different Israeli prime minister to begin to set this relationship into on much firmer ground and in a way that would benefit, really benefit both countries and not be seen as such a polarizing issue. I mean, I went out after October 7 and did a lot of fair number of talks at college campuses. I mean, it was bad. I mean, we waged war against Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years. Thousands of Americans were killed. Tens of thousands of Afghans and Iraqis were killed. You never saw the kinds of demonstrations on college campuses. I remember in Ann Arbor in the late 60s, early 70s. We were not in session when Kent State occurred. But I could see why college kids were out in the streets because for them it was existential. The war was wrong. Men could be drafted. So I think I mean, the U.S.-Israeli relationship has now become, in the minds of many Americans, toxic, to say the least. And clearly that's the case with many in a younger generation. Sorry to drone on about this, but it's an important point.
Um, Another question from Renee. Do you see any leaders on the horizon that could achieve change on these global issues? Is
You
that
know,
something you can
I
give your
wish,
opinion on?
I wish, I don't see, I mean, the authoritarian societies, which characterize most of, well, every country in the Arab world, um, I mean, you have leaders like Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi who have introduced far-ranging changes, more progressive changes, rights for women, a broadening of the sort of culture, what Saudis can now see and experience. But it's come at a cost of extraordinary repression. And I don't, those sorts of leaders, the kind, again, it's no coincidence that Donald Trump is fascinated by the Gulf because it has many of the elements that he cares deeply about and feels comfortable with. Authoritarian leaders, oil, and financial deals. But no, I don't see, you need a Mandela and a de Klerk. You don't have a Mandela and a de Klerk. And I just wonder and worry um, if leadership, as I've argued, is so elemental and we don't have it, what then is the alternative? And I'm afraid the alternative is just managing. And maybe that wouldn't be so bad if you got practical leaders who aren't transformers in a positive way, but could be transactors and could maybe begin to end conflict through limited agreements. The Israelis and Lebanese are sitting down today, actually, in Washington for a second meeting, which they haven't done since the early 90s. I mean, I'm not sure much will come of these negotiations, but it's a good sign. But again, most of the leaders in the Arab world and in Israel are under either severe constraints or they manage societies that are not democratic polities. And the war, I think, particularly in the Gulf, will squash a lot of reform ideas that people have and focus a lot on recovery and security because the Gulf states are going to be left with an angry, bitter, and still quite capable Iranian regime.
And all the damage this has caused to them.
And all the damage.
Well, yeah. A question from Joan. You mentioned that we're blessed with non-predatory neighbors, but now our president shows predatory tendencies. Can we expect to continue to have non-predatory neighbors?
It's a great
And,
question.
and let me throw in on top of that, do you have any hope that what Canada is doing with these, what are they called, middle countries, this new bloc it's sort of formed, can have any power in any of this?
Um, Look, it's a tough question. We have abandoned alliance politics in any meaningful sense. The president has embraced authoritarians, whether it's Orban, of the late politically Orban, or Mohammed bin Salman, or Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates, or President Xi, who Trump's supposed to meet with in mid-May,
Well,
or
can
Putin. Um, we've undermined our allies. I met this morning with the ambassador from Finland,
mm,
and it's really, I mean, the way this administration is treating the Europeans, the ideological arguments that they're using, that somehow the Europeans have undermined the right civilizationist tendencies through their um, restrictions on free speech or their uh, tolerance of immigration, of immigrants, all of that. Um, Not to mention the president's consistent attacks on NATO. Um, a lot of people I respect, a lot of my colleagues at Carnegie think that the transatlantic alliance is never going to recover from it, that American leadership is permanently damaged, and that the questioner and the predatory nature, and it's a very good word to use because what we've seen in the last year is a degree of the aggrandizement of presidential power, a predation on the American system, unparalleled, unprecedented in American history. And it is, Harry Truman once quipped that Nixon may have read the Constitution, but he didn't understand it. With Donald Trump, it's worse than that.
he
And
doesn't care.
the courts have provided some relief and some constraint. But as I said to somebody the other day, there's a total lack of respect for effective constitutional governance in the society. You know, the word I, the pronoun I is mentioned only once in the Constitution of the United States. Do you know why the framers put it there? Why would they use a personal why would they use the word I, which Gibbon described as the most disgusting of pronouns? Why would the framers, founders put a personal pronoun in the Constitution? It's there because they embedded the inaugural oath that the president takes in Article 2 in the Constitution. And it was no coincidence. They did it in order to make it unmistakably clear that the office and the president who holds it is subordinate to the document and the principles of sovereignty, popular sovereignty. Even though the framers had their own version, I suspect, of what that actually meant. So the problem is that the founders, believed in moral self-governance, the ability of a leader to control and subordinate their passions, their demons, their egos, their personal needs to public virtue. You don't have a president like that. We never had a president that lacked any sense of moral self-governance. And the founders could not have guard against it. They feared it might come, but they constructed a system that the best that they could do, right? Separated and shared powers, checks and balances. But they couldn't guard against that. And that's predation. That's predatory. And the amount of destruction and damage that has been done is not going to come around easily. People ask me, well, we're all doomed, right? And what I say is, I got two kids, I got four grandkids. What I'm going to basically say to them, I'm going to mortgage their future by basically saying, well, it's over. America will never lead again. America cannot live up to the promises and the aspirations that we can. We're much better than this. So I can't, I refuse to accept that because no one on this call can see what's in front of them. And I can't either. And I will say to you, on October 6, 1973, my wife Lindsay and I happened to be in Jerusalem until October 7th, 2023. October 6th 1973 was the greatest intelligence failure in the history of the state of Israel and the greatest trauma. He had an Egyptian and Syrian attack on Yom Kippur, the October War, the Yom Kippur War. Within 6 years of that trauma, I watched on the White House lawn Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin, and Jimmy Carter sign a full treaty of peace. I never would have predicted that. No one ever could have. That out of that trauma could come such an extraordinary event. And that peace treaty, however imperfect, lasts to this day to the benefit of both peoples and to the benefit of the United States. So again, I can't, that's why I don't easily accept arguments that we're all doomed. It makes no sense to me. In fact, it's arrogant because you can't, how do you know? I mean, we could bring Pythia, the famed oracle at Delphi, put Pythia on this conversation and ask her what the future is going to be, and she wouldn't be able to tell you. Reading the best of Godin drills, she couldn't tell you.
Can we ask AI?
Hmm?
Can we ask AI?
If Pythia had AI, it might have been a different story. Well, that's a whole nother conversation, right? But no, again, I don't want to leave this on an unhappy, dour, and pessimistic note because I don't think there's no option here for that. I mean, I certainly don't want this vision of America to be the final vision that I see, and I will do everything I possibly can in my own limited way to try to work against that, to regain what we've lost. And if the glass is shattered, maybe it has to be put back together in a way that's not quite the same as when it broke. But it's a big country filled with a lot of very, very good people, kind people. And I think is concerning to me. The cruelty and the unkindness that is deployed in the way in our current conversation is a concern to me. I don't understand. I don't understand. Don't these people have good mothers to teach them and fathers to teach them what to do? Don't they have girlfriends and wives who say, what are you doing? Children who say, grown children who say, well, exactly what are you doing? Don't you realize? So, I mean, that to me is unfathomable. That I do not get.
And it's hard for us to get. Well, I just want to say there's at least one person on this program who's been singing your praises. She worked tangentially with you a while ago and says you're absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And it's too bad you're not in charge of everything to be able to resolve it.
Right.
So
Well, I thank you for that.
I want to thank you, David, on the part of Chevy Chase at Home for joining us today. This has just been fascinating and uplifting, and you've given us some hope. And to everyone else participating, thank you for joining Chevy Chase at Home today for our speaker series. I invite you to explore other programming listed on our website at chevychaseathome.org, all one word, and to consider joining us or another local village as a member or volunteer. And this concludes our program for today. Everyone be well, and thank you so much, David, who specifically asked me not to call him doctor.
And that would be bad. Thank you. Thank
Don't
you.
like that part, huh?
Thank you so much, Susan. It was
Thank
great,
you
great to
so
be
much,
here, and thanks everybody on the call.
Aaron.
Take care. Right, I got it. It's the hazard of using three names.
Yeah, yeah.
You're not the first, and you won't be the last. That's
Okay.
It'll be
Thanks,
okay.
David.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.